hello everybody. I'm Joey Flores, head of marketing for SafetyWing. You've probably seen material around the embassy saying that we're building a country on the internet. But what does that really mean in practice? Today, billions of people rely on social safety programs that are administered by the countries they come from. But not only do some of those programs fall apart when their citizens travel across borders, but some countries simply cannot be depended on for the long-term security of their citizens. In this session, we're exploring whether web3 technologies like DAOs and crypto could be helpful or even necessary to privatize those systems of support. Avichal, Garg, good friend of mine, is the co-founder of Electric Capital. It is a $4 billion venture fund investing in Web3 technologies. They've invested early in Solana, Deal, and Notion, among others. Before that, Avichal led teams at Google and Facebook. I'm actually going to riff for a second here. Avichal was in charge of search ranking algorithms at Google, so quite a brilliant mind. And today he funds builders creating the economy's communities and tools of tomorrow. One of those builders is Ian Lee, the co-founder of Syndicate, which is a Web3 platform that lets groups of people anywhere in the world pool money and invest together using smart contracts. Some of you might remember Syndicate's role in Constitution DAO, which raised $47 million in a few days in order to buy a copy of the US Constitution. Before that, Ian was at EDO Collab Ventures, helping launch early blockchain projects, exploring new models of ownership and governance. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Before we dive in, just in case, since we don't know the audience, Avichal, for those who may have heard the term but not fully grasped it, can you give us a one-line definition of what cryptocurrency actually is?
Sure. I have a question. Okay, hold up your hand if you... I don't want to not say it. Okay, hold up your hand if you know what Bitcoin is. Okay, great. Okay, keep your hand up if you know what Ethereum is. Okay. Keep your hand up if you have ever bought an NFT. Oh, that's a surprising number of people, actually. That's more than I would have guessed. There's some people that were like embarrassed. They were like, yeah, I did one time. Okay, cool. It just helps us calibrate on what the audience already kind of knows and where people are. Okay, to your question, what is a cryptocurrency? It's an overloaded term. It's not really a currency. The way I think about it is there's a token that aligns human or computational incentives. So it creates an incentive for some sort of network or marketplace to exist. And if it's well aligned, then you actually incentivize really, really good behavior. So Bitcoin, for example, is an incentive for people to go get a bunch of compute to solve a mathematical puzzle that is effectively a random lottery. And in doing so, they sort of secure the network. And it's all about sort of incentive structures, which I think is very relevant to what we're talking about here today.
Great. Ian, could you do the same thing for what is a DAO in plain English?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm excited to talk about DAOs. I thought they died 3 years ago. So I'm very happy to be here and talk about this stuff. The strict term is decentralized autonomous organization, which very much was like an outgrowth of the technology side of it. But the way I think about it is that it's a technology that coordinates human capital and financial capital natively on the internet together. So if you look at it through that lens, the design space for DAOs is actually very, very expansive beyond kind of how people really deep in the crypto community thinks about it today, which is in very like strict technical terms, like managing a treasury of assets or investing money or whatever, right? You can already start to imagine that there are many, many types of applications of DAOs, including social safety nets or other kind of community-based applications, which I think we've seen a lot of examples of over the years.
Can I give a little bit of a rant here? Okay, as a VC, I talk for a living, and so I have a rant on this. It's not about DAOs directly, but it sort of ties to it. Has anybody here read about the history of the Limited Liability Corporation? Raise your hand. No? Okay, one person. So I apologize, it's probably boring for you. So this sounds super dry, but it's actually super interesting. If you go back and read about how did corporations happen, there's actually a book on it. Can't you? Probably
Oh yeah, it's
called The Corporation. Yeah. So it sounds super boring, super interesting. Because if you think about a corporation as a piece of technology, it's a really important technical breakthrough, right? So in like 1650, there's the joint stock corporation gets created. And so this is like the Dutch East India Company and becomes the world's biggest corporation. But it's a technical breakthrough because what they did was they realized you could separate capital risk from labor risk. So like people could put capital into an entity and then other people could go take that money and do stuff with it. And that was a really big breakthrough because before that you had to use your own personal money, right? And so for about 200 years, to start a quote unquote corporation or a joint stock company, you had to go get permission from a king. Like the king had to give you the charter to start a corporation. And then in like the 1850s, a bunch of people said, well, that doesn't make any sense. We don't have kings here in the United States and the UK. And so I should just be able to go to my local state. I should be able to go to Pennsylvania, or I should be able to go to my, to the government and file a charter and become a corporation. And so in the 1850s, that became pretty straightforward to do. And this unlocked the Industrial Revolution, actually. It's a really important component alongside steam power and coal power. Because all of a sudden, you could pool more money than any one person could do on their own, right? And so now all of a sudden, you can have the Industrial Revolution because you get factories and railroads and all these like really mega projects that like one person couldn't have done on their own. But it opened up a whole bunch of other questions. It opened up some really hard challenges. So one of the challenges, for example, was like, well, what happens if a company accidentally kills somebody, right? There's an accident with a product. Who's liable? Like, are the people who put in the money liable? Or the people who run the company liable? Does anybody individually go to jail? There's some really interesting questions around free speech. Like, are these things allowed to have free speech? Are they people? Are they not people? Like, are they allowed to spend money in politics? Like, do we treat them like people? Right? And so in the 1850s, you can go back and you can read all of these things being litigated. People are like, well, I don't know. Like, should these things have free speech rights? And there are these really interesting discussions that happen. Like, well, if these things become too powerful and they have too much money, like they could really influence our politics in a bad way. Like, we don't want corporations to take over our politics. Like really forward-looking things that like we're now thinking about 150 years later. But a bunch of people had to sit down and figure out the rules around this stuff. And like, okay, well, where are the rules of how this new type of thing? Because it was a new entity, right? It's not a person. And what is a corporation? It's kind of a quasi-person. And so we had to create a bunch of rules around that. And so to bring it back to DAOs, I think we're kind of in a similar place now with the internet, which is humans and companies and code is non-jurisdictional, right? We kind of created a new jurisdiction altogether. And so we can now organize and collect capital and human talent in a way that's not a person and that's not a company in a traditional sense. And so it reopens all of these things we haven't had to think about for like 150 years or 200 years, which is like, well, how do the rules work here? Like, what jurisdiction is this thing in? If a bunch of people on the internet get together to do work, like, what the hell is that? Because it doesn't necessarily exist in Delaware. They don't even live in the same place. How do you pay them? Like, how does liability work if they screw up? Like, who do I sue? Are they allowed to participate in politics in certain countries? Like, do they have free speech rights? Or which countries free speech rights if they exist in multiple places? So it kind of like opens up all of these same questions again, actually, and we haven't had to think about them for 150 or 200 years. So I think it's a really interesting time, and DAOs are kind of like the first native container. So it's sort of like a catch-all term right now for what is like an internet native corporation. And what's crazy about it is the internet native corporation comes with a built-in bank, right? You have a wallet associated with it. And it comes with potentially like unlimited humans in the form of AI agents that can get paid by this capital stream on chain. So we're entering this like weird new world where like a lot of the old thinking around jurisdictions kind of doesn't make sense anymore because the internet is its own jurisdiction in a weird way. And DAOs, I think, are like this catch-all term right now for like almost like an internet native corporation. Corporation, not necessarily like a C Corp, like a collection of humans. But like all of the rules around it are very open, and how it interfaces back with the quote-unquote real world is still, there's like a bunch of open questions there, I think, which are all very interesting. Like, I think whoever figures this stuff out and figures out, how does this interface with AI agents, for example? Because I think AI agents basically have the same problem. Like, if somebody releases open source code on the internet and then somebody uses it to do something, there's questions of like free speech and liability and like what kind of disclosures you need and like what data went into train the model when you have an open weight model, and like what liability does Amazon have if they're the one hosting the model and then you used it to like do something nefarious. Like, you kind of hit all the same weird questions. And so whoever like figures all this stuff out and writes it down, I suspect in like 150 years, people will be talking about it and be like, oh yeah, those were all the critical issues when like smart contracts and crypto and people having free travel and being international and capital being able to be formed on chain, like all these things coming together. There's like a bunch of really interesting, like formative questions right now. Sorry for the rant.
No worries. I think like our whole theme for the past few weeks has been borderless living and sort of globalization and the changes that are happening. And I think what's interesting in what you're saying is like not only do we have to think about that in regards to how do we interact with those organizations in our country, but since they are global, everybody has to figure out the ways that their society would interact with these types of things, right? So we talk about building social safety net and a country on the internet. And what I was thinking about for the past few days preparing for this is sort of that if I was going to pay into a system that was going to provide a safety net for me 30 years from now, let's say retirement or something like that, like there has to be a very high level of trust. Like I'm not going to pay into something for 30 years that I'm expecting to be there when I need it unless I have a very high amount of trust. And I'm quite curious, Ian, maybe you can tackle this one, but do you think that web3 technologies, things like DAOs or cryptocurrency, do you think those are solutions to issues of transparency, trust, and accountability that would be necessary for something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for sure, right? Like DAOs and blockchains and crypto, they are a new technology that brings new capabilities into the world, right? So as it relates to transparency and trust, they certainly have certain features that no other piece of software, whether it's AI or traditional tech, have. And that's really exciting. I think one of the challenges, though, is that, right now, despite the fact that that capability is really amazing, a lot of things are not 100% on chain, right? And sometimes for good reason, right? Sometimes because they still need to interface with the real world. Sometimes a lot of those activities are not, fully able to come completely onto a blockchain yet for various reasons. Sometimes they need to interface with, things outside of just the digital sort of space. We saw this a lot when we started, when we came out of stealth and launched our product. We helped DAOs buy land in Wyoming. We helped, we tried to help like a DAO buy the U.S. Constitution, which lost to a hedge fund billionaire.
Which is an epic story about
Ontario,
greed internet lore. It's like a pretty amazing story.
Yeah, you can
said it all.
Yeah, said it all. Yeah, we helped DAOs invest in founders and startups, right? Like Coma Revi was this one that we helped launch, which was this kind of group of women that were investing in other women led startups and founders. So we have a whole bunch of experience with this, and I think one of the issues was actually kind of connected to what Avichal was saying, which is like with every single one of those where they wanted to affect some kind of change in the real world, things couldn't fully be on chain, or they often wanted to interface with the real world, right? They wanted legal contracts, they wanted service provider agreements, they wanted bank accounts with real financial institutions. They wanted fiat, payments coming from other people's banks into the DAO. So until kind of like more of that goes on chain, and certainly that was like almost 5 years ago when we started the company, a lot more has come on chain, right? A lot of the infrastructure has improved, regulation has improved, all of these things have improved, but it's still not 100% on chain. It's still going to live in this kind of like hybrid state. And so, I think that coming back to your question, like it absolutely provides like greater transparency and accountability kind of capabilities. But I think the key is like, as you kind of build these solutions using blockchain technology, like what can truly go on chain versus like what needs to rely on the real world, and how do you actually interface those things with the appropriate like kind of accountability and disclosures and stuff like that. I think is like a big part of where things get messy.
I have a rant on this too. Can I give you a 30-second rant? I'll keep it short. Okay, so the key word I think in the question that you asked is trust. And so if you rewind 10 years, as I was leaving Facebook, we sold our company, we've been there 5 years, it was great. And my co-founder and I were doing a bunch of thinking about what happens over the next 10 years. This is like an exercise we're doing now too. And I came across this data from Pew Research in like circa 2015. And it showed this really long-term data where they asked people all over the Western world, how much do you trust these various institutions? And it was like, not at all, somewhat, neutral, like a 5-point scale, like a Likert scale. And what was fascinating was you could see this really long-term decline starting in about 1970 in every major public institution, like public schools, banks, the press, judiciary. I think the only institution that didn't have this decline was like the military. But literally, like every institution that was created after World War II that made the West work had this decline. It basically inverted. Like in 1970, it was 70% of people trusted these institutions. Like 70% of people trusted the press, 70% of people trusted banks, 70% of people trusted, public schools. And by about 2015, it had inverted. It had become 30% of people trusted these things, and 70% didn't. And it was this sort of, and it was true across the entire Western world. It was true in the UK, it was true in France, it was true in Spain, Canada, the United States. You could just see this long-term decline. And what I think is interesting about the technologies that we have now, things like cryptography or trusted execution environments or zero-knowledge proofs, is it allows you to reimagine those institutions in an internet-native way without having to require the same mechanism of trust. Like the old mechanism of trust was essentially to trust the humans that were in the institution, and hopefully the humans do the right thing. But there can be culture drift, there can be mission drift, there can be corruption and capture in all sorts of ways. And now you have this programmatic and cryptographic controls in these systems. And so when you set up the rules of the system, you can force the system to behave in certain ways and create incentive structures that force that. And you can cryptographically verify those things. So I think that actually the opportunity here, when we're talking about things like DAOs or things like SafetyWing or the internet as a whole, is how do we reimagine all of these institutions in an internet-native way, in a transparent and open way, and in a way where the cryptography and the math and the incentive structures are verifiable, so anybody can see what's happening. And I think that's how you rebuild trust in these institutions. And some of those things I think governments will have to do, and some of those things I think governments can't do. And that's an opportunity. So I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, that's actually the interesting thing. What are the kinds of things that we see in these massive collapses of trust, and now using new technology, which inherently assumes, like that's what's so cool about cryptography and these blockchain systems and these web3 systems, is they assume that you can't trust your counterparty, right? That the fundamental assumption of trust is inverted, but that actually makes sense in the environment that in which we now exist. And so I think that's actually like a huge opportunity. DAOs will be one of those structures, but like from a user perspective, what are all of the places that from like 1970 to today have just collapsed in trust? And how do we reimagine those institutions such that you don't even have to trust the humans in the institution, the incentive structures, and the cryptography will sort of provide the trust that you need.
I want to expand on that. This might be the last question we have time for, but it's a great segue into a question I wanted to ask you, which is, you create trust by making these things sort of impervious to human interaction, right? Like you program like how they're supposed to work, the governance and all these things into the structure, and people theoretically cannot, jump in and do anything that they shouldn't, right? But I just heard this story about this woman who was in a Waymo, and two men decided to start harassing her from outside the car, and because the Waymo is programmed like not to hit anybody or whatever, it just sat there while this woman was being accosted by these two people, and she couldn't get the car to go anywhere. So if we're building a social safety net that's supposed to respond quickly to emergencies, let's say we need to do mass extraction from like an uprising in a country, and we're supposed to support the people that are there who are citizens of our internet country, how do you create, and we don't have time for a really long answer, but how do you sort of make a system that is both impervious to influence from people when that shouldn't happen, but can respond quickly or be versatile in a situation that is like unforeseen or where acting rapidly is absolutely necessary?
Yeah, so a lot of experience in this, and my high-level takeaway from working in the DAO space for so many years is that the approach to this philosophically is actually bottom-up, not top-down. So I think one of the issues is that, to your point, that these systems are actually really difficult to design, as this one-size-fit-all kind of system. When in fact, what these org structures or these internet native structures will look like in the future is actually this almost like fractal where there's almost infinite sort of sub-communities that are able to dynamically manage based on certain users, certain applications, certain needs, certain issues that happen like on the ground in real time. And then they actually aggregate up to kind of this collective network-based organization. So I think, yeah, that's like kind of my real big takeaway over the years is that like most people kind of came at it from this like top-down, let's design one system that can like rule them all or serve all needs, when in fact, actually the best approach is, which is what's kind of happening commercially in the world right now, is like, it's just bottom up, like from a micro level, and then starting to like re-aggregate as appropriate.
Thank you. Alma, we're out of time, I'm assuming. Is that correct? One more question. Amazing. Okay. So this question actually came from our CEO. So, we think a lot about the idea of internet passports. If we're going to establish a country on the internet, we want to have some form of identification, and we expect to have like diplomatic solutions and visas and things like that. We need to kind of understand better how our long-term vision of bridging online identity with real-world mobility would come together. So, I'm not sure who wants to answer this, but what are the hardest problems to solve to make an internet passport work in practice?
Well, I have 2 or 3 thoughts on this. The practical reality is that most countries are not going to recognize a new country. Like, how do you get that in the United Nations? And if there's no physical geography, it sort of breaks the notion of country as far as most countries are concerned. So kind of like with the DAOs, and Ian has a bunch of experience with this, like interfacing with Wyoming, you kind of have to find a way to backport it. And so likely what you need to do is find a small number of countries that are willing to essentially be the physical manifestation of this sort of digital country, and use that as a bridge. And then you can lean on things like KYC and making sure you do background checks for passports and that sort of stuff. And so places like the Marshall Islands or so the Caribbean countries that have been really smart about investment by passport. There are places in the world where maybe Singapore, like they're going to look at this as a business opportunity, and they're going to say, wait a second, Estonia played with this like 10 years ago with like e-services. And so I suspect that's probably one big component of this, is like how do you backport this into kind of the old frameworks. The other thing I'll note is I think that it's entirely possible that the way that we think about identity changes going forward. Like I think today what you have is like your government identity, your sort of birth identity, and your work identity are kind of the same thing. And that there's no reason that actually needs to be the case. You could actually split all of these. And in fact, you could have multiple work identities. I think people intuitively understand you can have multiple personal identities, right? Like how you present yourself in different groups can be different. And then you could have government identity. And actually, I think that whole space is underexplored. Like you could imagine some world where you're technically a citizen of the Marshall Islands and you have a passport from there, which gives you sort of ability to move around. But you have 2 different work identities, right? For 2 different types of jobs that you need to do, and you're essentially pseudonymous. You can get paid in those currencies, and there's a way for you to pay your taxes properly, so you're trying to like money launder or anything. But this actually gives you some really nice protections, right? This gives you physical protection that people don't necessarily like. You have if you're in a particular business and your business is booming, and you made $10 million that year. If you really want everybody in the world to know that you just made $10 million that year, it's kind of like if you have kids, it becomes like a safety issue depending on where you are in the world, right? And so actually, there's some advantages to breaking out identity. So I think like one big problem is going to be how do you backport it into the real world. And then I think the opportunity going forward is like, what does it even mean to have identity? And I think because these forms of identity used to all be one, there's actually an opportunity to like, if you know the old Jim Marcel quote, it's like there's 2 business models basically. There's bundling and unbundling. We've had a bundling of identity. And so I think there's a really big opportunity for people to unbundle identity and explore kind of what that looks like.
2 quick comments building on what Avichal said. Yeah, I think this bottom-up approach to identity is also like a good example. You see this actually in the DAO space where people's, quote, identity is actually an aggregation of multiple identities across different interactions with different digital DAOs or digital nations, right? So I think the future of identity is one that is like this fractal that is aggregated and is not like one singular thing. So I think that also sort of extends there. And then
potentially with selective disclosure, like you build like ZK proofs in there, and it's like, well, I'll just reveal to you the 6 forms of identity that like prove to you that I'm credible in this particular way, but nobody else needs to know that those 6 things are actually tied together.
Yeah,
like cryptography makes this really interesting.
Yeah, like you can be both Bruce Wayne and Batman in the future, as opposed to like today, you're like both doxed as Batman and Bruce Wayne, right? And then the other thing is maybe just like an example, right? Kind of what Avichal was saying about how in the near term these things will bridge to the real world. So we recently launched our network and DAO effectively, and we did that in Wyoming as a nonprofit under this new structure called a DUNA. And we were very like US centric about it. Wyoming has like strong privacy protections for members of nonprofits. There's a lot of features kind of around that make it optimal for decentralized organizations to actually exist in the United States, like in Wyoming. Wyoming in the US being like the first example, but there are other jurisdictions that are also doing their own versions of this that Avichal kind of mentioned. So I think that this is like the early stages coming all the way back to the very beginning of like the new limited liability corporation that is internet native. And, you know, it may take decades, but I think it has been starting. It's been underway for, you know, at least a decade, but I think a lot of these things will start to really proliferate over the next 5 to 10 years.
And for anybody that wants to go deep on the DUNA Wyoming stuff, I think Syndicate has done a lot of firsts in this area. And so if you just go search for Syndicate, there's blog posts and press articles and stuff about how they thought about interfacing with Wyoming and the DUNA architecture. They've done a lot of really clever things.
Everybody, thank you for coming to our TED Talk. Avichal, Garg, Ian Lee from Syndicate. I think we're going to do a coffee break, but I'll let Alma come up and do the expert job of letting you all know that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.